Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, welcome to Palestine Talks. You're a Palestinian Christian, born in Bethlehem. You study in the United States. You taught at Yale University. Currently, you're teaching at Bethlehem University and Birzeit University. You're a biologist, but you've also been an author, become an author, and been an activist for many years. What took you to the United States? How did you become an activist, and what took you back to Palestine?
So I was born in Beit Sahur, the shepherd's field, and from my childhood I was always running around in the valleys around Bethlehem, those shepherds areas that, the shepherds heard the angels sing, went up to Bethlehem where Jesus was born. I learned to love this nature, and I learned to love the atmosphere of pastoral life, agricultural life. It's beautiful nature in Palestine. As you know, it's part of the Fertile Crescent. So as a Palestinian, of course, our connection to the land is very strong. But for me, even more so because of my interest in biology, my interest in animals and plants. So I ended up doing a lot of observation of butterflies and birds and things like that. So I've always wanted to study biology from my childhood, and that's what I ended up doing. And of course, we couldn't do this in Palestine under occupation and colonization. There wasn't universities that could do this. So I ended up getting my bachelor degree in Jordan and my master's and PhD degrees in the US, and working in the US for a while to basically improve my knowledge of biology and be able to do the kind of research and service that I have engaged in since. That's how I ended up in the US, as a place to study and place to develop my skills in biology and environmentalism and so on. But my interest in Palestine remained even while I was in the US for almost 3 decades. My interest in nature and conservation of Palestine was important. So I even did both my master's degree and my PhD degree, the thesis research was on the areas of our region, North Africa and Western Asia, the Arab world, and specifically Palestine.
At some stage during your study, your eyes were open to some of the realities in the international system, the injustices, particularly in South Africa. Was that a turning point for you in your understanding of the world and in starting a commitment to activism?
Yes, when I was doing my bachelor degree in Jordan, there were some internationals there who asked me, where are you from and whatever, and I tell them Bethlehem and Palestine, and they'd ask me about the situation. I'd have to explain, so I started to read, but I really was not activist in that sense. Up until I went to the US and I was at the University of Connecticut, when you're put on the spot as a foreign student, so to speak, in a foreign country. You had to defend what is going on and what is happening, and what people had misperceptions. I'm talking about 1979, early 1980. When I was in the US first semester. And this is basically was my turning point, is my being put on the spot to defend who I am and to be able to tell my narrative. But also, it allowed me to start to see the global connections, because there were students from around the world at the university, and they would ask me. I was elected president of the International Student Club at the University of Connecticut, and I was asked to do some things regarding South Africa, for example, and apartheid. And that's how I ended up actually learning about South Africa and learning the similar problems to the ones I faced when I was in Palestine. So in 1980, I became more and more active, and then another upshift in my activism occurred in 1987, 1988, when a new uprising came about, and my village in Beit Sahur was taking a lead in this, in resistance, basically, and providing a model for other villages in resistance. And I was trying to work from abroad to help them, to support them, to tell their stories. And I say it's our stories, but I was in the US, and so I was telling about the suffering of people, friends of mine who were killed in 1988, for example. So I felt the US media is not covering things. So I've started being involved more in the media activism in 1988. And that took me to another level of activism and support for people that are, whether in South Africa or in Palestine, who are suffering, who needed support, and who the Western media and Western politicians were short-shifting them and ignoring them, and even worse, maligning them and participating in dehumanizing us as an indigenous people, saying we are terrorists, we are this, we are that, when in reality we are the victims of colonization.
1987, of course, was the beginning of the First Intifada, and it was 20 years after the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza. The resistance of the Palestinians was very widespread. It was largely non-violent and locally organised, and it was crushed very brutally by the Israelis. And this was a period where international opinion turned again against Israel for a period of time because of the brutality, because of the images of stone-throwing children going up against tanks. The Intifada, the First Intifada, essentially lasted until the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which changed the regional dynamic. You've maintained a belief in the benefits or the rightness of popular resistance, and you've documented it in your book, Popular Resistance in Palestine. You've documented over the decades the resistance of the Palestinians in the various phases of their subjugation, their expulsion, and you maintain a support and belief in both popular resistance and non-violent resistance, but you don't just say that, you say that people have a right to resist in whatever way they can in these situations.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, any colonial, anti-colonial struggle, there are many forms of resistance that the local people engage in. But we have to step back and realize that colonization itself is violence. You cannot colonize somebody's land, steal their houses, steal their natural resources without violence. You have to use violence to displace indigenous people. And that's happened here in Australia, for example, with the Aboriginal people. It happened in North America with the Native Americans. It happened in South Africa with the Zulus facing the Dutch and British colonization. It happened everywhere there was colonization, which happens to be throughout the world, that the colonizers use extreme forms of violence in order to acquire the land and the natural resources that they want to acquire. By contrast, of course, the reaction of the local people is varied, and some local people resist verbally, some resist by civil disobedience, by refusing to obey the rules of the colonizers, insisting on keeping their language and their culture and so forth. There are literally hundreds of forms of resistance that they can and do engage in. And it's natural everywhere on earth for colonized people to engage in all these forms of resistance, yes, including armed resistance. But armed resistance is usually a minority because not, 90-year-old or a woman or a child may not engage in armed resistance. So most of the people, also their background, their abilities, who can get weapons, whatever, is very limited. So most people engage in what we call unarmed resistance. Some people call it nonviolent resistance. We in Palestine call it muqawama sha'biyya, popular resistance. Mahatma Gandhi called it satyagraha and ahimsa. He refused to use the term nonviolent resistance because it implies, that's somehow against the violence or against the violence of the natives. But it is not. It is simply another form, another tool of resistance that people use, and we have used it, and local people have used it, and depending on their leanings and their background. A child, as you said, may pick up a stone, throw at a tank. Now, whether you consider this violent resistance or non-violent, I don't know, but it's a form of resistance that they engage in. And certainly the Israelis and the colonizers in general consider any indigenous resistance to be terrorism, whether it's armed, unarmed, violent, not violent, peaceful demonstration. They consider us all terrorists by nature because they want the land. They don't want these people who come with the land. And the people who come with the land are like obstacle in their way. So an obstacle is an obstacle, whether the obstacle is doing something or not doing something, or even just sitting around. Even if you don't do anything, you're still targeted, you're still oppressed, and you're still kicked out of your homes and lands. So that's what happens with colonizers and colonized people. I do want to say about the issue of uprising. In 1987 to 1991, there was an uprising. It happened to be uprising number 12, actually. There were uprisings going back to 1880 against the Zionist colonizers. And uprisings come and go as waves like this. And these waves, of course, sometimes it's almost a generational thing. On average, we had an uprising on average every 10 years in Palestine. That's because children grow and they become teenagers, and young people, are more active and they're willing to engage in resistance. The older people may get frustrated and simmer down a little bit, and it goes back up. That's natural to have those uprisings, or as we call them in Arabic, intifadas. Intifada means shaking off the occupation, the colonization. And as long as the occupation and colonization remain, there will be uprisings. In South Africa, under apartheid, there were 15 uprisings. And so in Palestine, we had 14 so far. And so hopefully the next one will be the last one also before we end this racist apartheid regime.
For Palestinians and their supporters internationally, this attack on Gaza is seen in the context of the colonial nature of the Israeli state. They're not two communities living peacefully side by side, but an apartheid state aggressively colonizing what's left of Palestine and using extreme violence against any resistance. So there's an understanding that this is a colonial war, and it's demonstrated certainly in its ruthlessness. For much of the West, at least Western media and Western governments, they see no history prior to October 7th, and they seem to see no crimes post-October 7th. They simply see October 7th. What are your thoughts about what seems to be the willful blindness or indifference of the West, the reasons for it, and whether it will change?
I mean, it's expected for colonizers and their supporters to try and ignore history and ignore context and ignore what's happening on the ground because they have a message to relay. What's that message? I mean, if you think about, in colonization of North America and the fact that there was the so-called Indian-American Wars, they used an excuse of one rebellion to say, let's wipe out the rest of the Indians, as they called them, the Indians, because they are confused about where they were as colonizers. But anyways, this is typical of colonizers, is to frame the issues in the way they want to frame them to justify what they want to do. But as far as, colonization and its history, I mean, it's now well documented, and I do want to bring up who used the term colonization first relevant to coming to Palestine. Was actually the second governor of Australia, a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel George Gawler, or Gawler, I guess you say in Australia. But anyway, this guy was charged by the British Empire in the mid-19th century with looking into establishing Jewish colonies. This is the terminology they use, Jewish colonies in Palestine. And he wrote an opus on this, like over 300 pages, explaining how this can and should be done. There's a connection here, by the way, because he was so good at doing the penal colonies here and developing the penal colonies in Australia that they chose him because he was so successful at destroying the resistance of the indigenous people, of the Aboriginal people in Australia. So they chose him to lead this effort. And he ended up submitting his report to the British government. The British government adopted it. In 1847, the British Parliament passed a resolution in support of it. And then they proceeded in the 1850s of creating groups like what they called the Jewish Colonization Association. So they used the terminology of colonization in the 19th century regularly on this. And then when the political Zionist movement was crystallized in the 1880s, they used the terms colonization. Again, Herzl's father, Theodor Herzl, who's credited sometimes with being the biggest organizer of the Zionist movement, when he convened the first World Zionist Congress in 1897, his father actually was a Zionist, and his father regularly used the word colonization. And even Herzl himself used the word colonization. So Jewish Colonization Association prospered with funding from Rothschild and Montefiore and the British government. This is important. And the British government, which created, for example, the Palestine Exploration Fund, to explore the country before they colonize it, just like they did with Australia here. So this is typical history of colonization. There's nothing different about it. Of course, in the late 20th century, colonization became a bad word and they don't use it anymore. But the colonizers used that term all the time earlier. So to go back to the issue of colonization, anti-colonization, the framing of colonizers is well known. I mean, whether it's in South Africa or whether it's in what became known as the United States of America, the framing was, we're circling the wagons, we're protecting ourselves against those savages, barbarians, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, with painted faces and language we don't understand. Maybe it's a religious conflict, we don't care. But they hate us for some unknown reason. They hate us as a white, beautiful European settlers who are bringing civilization, manifest destiny, shiny city on the hill, you know, bringing modern technology to these savages. For some reason, they don't like it. They seem to like their savage ways. So we have to brainwash them. We have to kill them if need be. Take their children, re-educate. Now they're talking about re-educating Gaza, by the way. Imagine, you know, in the 21st century, as if we haven't learned anything from history, to re-educate people, to put them in brainwashing, to create new reality that's conducive to colonization, that's supportive of colonization.
That's of course built on the notion that the only resistance to Israel can be based on some blind, unreasoning hate. It has nothing to do with the realities of expulsion, dispossession, colonization, the apartheid state, the military occupation, the settlements, that it's a mindless hate, and it can only be dealt with by brainwashing, not by changing, or by killing, and not by changing the realities that generate resistance. You've raised a lot of really interesting points. One of the things that's been notable about the Zionist enterprise in Palestine is they've relied very heavily on external sponsors. So it fell to Britain to sponsor the Zionist project in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the military occupation of Palestine in the same year, the mandate giving Britain control until 48, the smashing of the Palestinian revolt, 36 to 39, by Britain, the facilitation of Jewish migration to Palestine. The external sponsor was extremely important. The United States took over that role from, I guess, from the time of recognition of Israel, but more substantially in the 50s. And today we see the genocide in Gaza being enabled both diplomatically by the American protection in the UN, but by the unending supply of munitions. So the external sponsor has been really critical for the Zionist movement. There's also been the role of Western media, in particular people like Rupert Murdoch, whose organisation seems to behave as a mouthpiece for the Israeli government. And the history of lies about the reality of Israel, about the creation of Israel, about the reasons for Palestinian resistance, that history goes back a long way with the Western media. And the crimes of the present are built on the lies of the past. And that has continued to this day. What are your thoughts about the role of social media, which has brought the horrific reality of this genocide to much of the world now and has reduced the dependence of people on traditional media?
I mean, here I want to say that colonization that's happening in Palestine is similar in many ways to all other colonization. But there is some unique features. One unique feature, what you mentioned, the level of co-sponsorship and partnership, really, not just support, partnership by Western imperial power of this project. Starting actually with Napoleon, who first also thought it's a good idea to have Jewish colonization in Palestine around the turn of the 19th century, 18th to 19th century. But the French were not as good as the British in terms of successfully colonizing. That's why English is the dominant language in the world much more than French. The British were really good at mobilizing and at doing things, whether it's in Palestine or Australia, of course, in the Americas even. The French were in the Americas, but the US ended up as an mostly English-speaking country. Why were the British more successful? Because they built it on what's called scientific colonialism. Scientific colonialism means that you study the area really well, understand the nuances, use divide and conquer among the local people. For example, in North America, the different tribes and maybe the rivalries between the different tribes of the indigenous people, and you use divide and conquer. In the Middle East, divide and conquer is very typical of the colonial approach to our region, as they call it, the Middle East. I like to call it Western Asia. But anyways, this is why the British, who have, of course, spawned this entity called the United States, which turned out to be, as Martin Luther King said, the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. In the New World, the U.S. gained supremacy after the Second World War, became the dominant power, and killed millions of people after 1945. So the U.S. has become the bigger sponsor of colonialism in its new forms, not necessarily the old forms, like colonization via capitalist expansion and control of natural resources via the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to subjugate smaller countries, etc. The old colonialism remained in very few places on earth. As I said, South Africa was only in 1989 that it moved to a post-colonial struggle era. But colonialism is still very, very active in Palestine. It's active in only a couple of other places I could name, like Western Sahara by Morocco, also U.S. sponsorship of that, and Tibet in China, Tibet, China thing. Very few places. I cannot think of another one even off the top of my head. So it's rare now to have the old style colonialism practiced, and we have it practiced in Palestine. So the question is, what makes this unique in Palestine? Besides, if I compare it to Western Sahara or Tibet, Tibet is bringing a lot of people, China is bringing a lot of people into Tibet to colonize it, and a lot of Tibetan people are displaced. Not at the same rate as Palestine. Palestine is worse. We have 8 million refugees or displaced people. Again, not anywhere near what happened in Western Sahara is not anywhere near what happened in Palestine. But what makes it unique in other ways? Well, it's displacement settler colonialism, number one. That's very, very strong displacement. Israel is not interested in even keeping manual labor, indentured labor of the native Palestinians. They want them out. They're willing to import workers from India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, or wherever, rather than employ Palestinian, leftover Palestinians inside the country. That's number one. Number two is, as we said, this level of Western support that's unprecedented. They didn't care. I mean, the Western governments did support apartheid in South Africa. Every single Western government, Australia even, the UK, US, they all supported apartheid in South Africa. After Nelson Mandela died, they all went to his funeral and they said, hey, we supported freedom for South Africa. Nonsense. The governments were with apartheid. It was the people of those countries that pushed against it. And we see the same thing now with Palestine. People of the world, including here in Australia. I was at a rally here in Adelaide on Sunday. Hundreds of people were at the rally. So the people are with us, but the governments are not with us. So that's a second unique feature of this, is that the governments are very committed to this Zionist project, the Western governments. They consider it even existential for them to support it. That's because there is a very strong Zionist lobby around those countries. Even Australia, which has not very many Zionists, I think it has like, 100,000 Jews living here. Maybe half of them support Zionism, support Israel, the other half doesn't. But you can see with this very tiny Zionist population, it has a lot of influence, as you mentioned, like Rupert Murdoch and the media empire and the government itself that has to watch what it says and what it does, and ends up signing military agreements with Israel worth hundreds of millions of dollars and support genocide, basically. So this is another unique feature, that there's this Zionist lobby around the world that manages to influence governments and influence media. The third thing I would say that's kind of unique about this current situation is the social media, which brings me to what you were referring to. Social media and availability of these phones that you can videotape and immediately broadcast is very unusual in the history of genocides. It didn't exist in the hundreds of previous genocides, and there were hundreds of genocides, from Rwanda, with the Tutsis, to Armenian genocide, to genocide of Gypsies and Jews in Europe in the Second World War, or Japan and Manchuria and China, and the genocide of the Chinese. Hundreds of genocide. Vietnam was genocide. 2 to 3 million Vietnamese were killed by the Americans. War in Vietnam, etc. All these genocides were horrific. Some of them are worse than others. The worst genocide is probably the killing of the natives in North America and South America. There are estimates of 100 to 150 million indigenous people who were butchered or killed by diseases the Europeans brought to the Americas, or as they call them, the Americas. But anyways, this is unique in that it's broadcast live and people can see it on social media. People are even videotaping their own death. Literally, I've seen people, including doctors, who were sheltering next to a building and videotaping, saying, "We're being shelled." And then the next scene you see is the phone laying down, pointing up, the guy was killed. So they are documenting their own destruction and broadcasting it live. So this is very unusual in the history of genocides, and people cannot say, "I didn't know," or whatever. I mean, when King Leopold butchered so many people through the Belgian army in the Congo and cut off the hands of people because they didn't harvest enough cocoa plants and for the chocolates that now we talk about Belgian chocolates. That's the genocide committed for chocolates, Okay, it happened, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. People forget about it and they ignore it. But you cannot ignore what's happening now as we speak, what's happening in Gaza and in those areas. And social media is very powerful, and that's why also the Zionists are trying to control it and have spent millions and millions of dollars to infiltrate social media and put out messages and talking points which they insist everybody regurgitate. Typical talking points, again, any person with a few neurons can realize that these are lies and distortions about terrorism, about the Palestinians being intrinsically violent, etc.
To that point, a US congressman was recently interviewed by the Wall Street Journal about the renewed push in the United States to crack down or even ban TikTok. And the ostensible reasons are that it's a vehicle for the Chinese government to carry out subversion or surveillance. This particular congressman said, we recently looked again at TikTok because we were just so angered by the amount of pro-Palestinian videos, pro-Palestinian meaning showing the destruction of Gaza, and that this renewed our enthusiasm, our efforts for the banning of TikTok. So again, we see the lobby using one reason for public consumption and its advocates or its helpers admitting that they have another reason for their interest in controlling social media, and that's to protect Israel. One of the striking things about Israeli apartheid, and perhaps it's any apartheid, though there hasn't been that many examples in the modern world, is it seems to be relentless. From the beginning, the colonisation wanted everything. They wanted all of Palestine and some of the surrounding countries as well. Since in its creation, Israel expelled half the Palestinian population and took nearly 80% of the country. Then they took the rest of the country in '67, and in that, since then, there's been renewed efforts to dominate the region. And so we see Israel heavily implicated in the destruction of Iraq, using the United States over the non-existent weapons of mass destruction. So Israel has been a nuclear power for over 50 years, and its survival doesn't require the destruction of Syria or Iraq or the pursuit of Iran, which they're continuing to do. But it seems that nothing is ever enough for Israel, either internally or in terms of dominating the region.
Yes, you bring up a very good point. Israel's ambition is to be an empire. Israel is the only country on earth that has not said what its borders are now. They continue to expand to whatever borders they feel they can expand to. The 1919, before 1917, before the Balfour Declaration, the map the Zionists presented is between the Euphrates and the Nile River. That includes Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, parts of what's now Saudi Arabia, Sinai, and of course Eastern Egypt. This is what they had planned before 1917. In the Paris meeting after the First World War, 1919, there was a meeting. The Zionist movement was presented, and they were asked, the Arabs were not presented, the local people were not represented at this post-war conference. But anyway, the Allies who won the war, First World War, thanks to partly to Zionists pushing the U.S. to enter the war on behalf of the Allies, lobbying, and it was a quid pro quo. That's why we had the Balfour Declaration and the Jules Cambon Declaration. Balfour Declaration from Britain, 1917. On the same year, Jules Cambon Declaration from France in support of the Zionist project. And these two declarations, public declarations, were made in the middle of the war to the Zionist movement as a promise of support for establishing Jewish colonies in Palestine, in return for the Zionist movement lobbying the United States to get into the First World War, or at that time it was called the Great War. Anyways, in 1919, they held a conference after that war to kind of divide up the areas. That's when the British mandate came into beings, if you want. So the idea was, 1919, they asked the Zionist movement, well, okay, we'll help you establish, but where do you want this state? What is this Jewish state going to be? And the Zionists presented a map, hand-drawn actually, showing parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, most of Jordan, parts of Sinai, parts of Saudi Arabia. This was a slightly reduced map from the one I told you earlier that they had before 1917. To my knowledge, that map is still the only map that's actually handed by the Zionist movement to other countries. It's a map that, as I said, it shows a regional empire, not between the Euphrates and the Nile, but slightly smaller. And this is what they aimed for, and this is what they tried to achieve, for example, when they occupied South Lebanon to the Litani River, to get access to the Litani water, etc. And they ended up occupying the Golan and the Sinai for a while, and then back out of the Sinai. Ironically, they backed out of the Sinai to the border that is available on that 1919 map, which is 1/3 of the Sinai is effectively now under Israeli control, because the Egyptian army cannot send a single soldier there without permission from the Israelis.
This is a result of Kissinger's diplomacy.
Yes. Kissinger, who was a Zionist stooge, basically had really pushed for this. So, you know, the idea of regional hegemony has never gone away. And in fact, as recently as September, Mr. Netanyahu at the United Nations showed a map. This map shows Israel without borders, but has the word Israel on the map, and showing that Israel is the connection between Europe and Asia. And he says, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia are friends of ours, and we will have this corridor connecting Asia to Europe through Israel without a border, because he still plans to expand. And this is an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative that China has worked on, which is from the remnant of the Silk Road that they used to have to Europe. So this is the idea, and he presented this at the UN in diplomatic language, if you want. But in front of Israeli public, he didn't use diplomatic language. I know some Hebrew, and he was on Israeli TV showing the same map, but talked about it in a different way, which is to say that we will be the dominant economic power in the Middle East, and beyond that. This is his words, and beyond that. So they are planning to develop much, much beyond the Middle East or our region.
So in recent times, we've seen, over a number of years, the attempts by the Israelis to achieve regime change in Iran and potentially the fragmentation of Iran. And we've got both the impulse for regional domination and, again, divide and rule, which they've successfully enacted in many Arab countries, either directly or through the agency of the United States. But we also have an attempt to take away external support, external actors supporting the Palestinians and giving them hope. What this policy has meant is that the risk of nuclear war in the region is becoming a reality. A war with Iran, which has now close relations with China and with Russia, could see significant Iranian retaliation on Israel and Israeli use of nuclear weapons. The fact that the Americans rushed to position their warships off the coast of Gaza at the beginning of the genocide shows how integral the American presence is to the Zionist project. So this genocide and beyond that, the Israeli ambitions for regional dominance run a real risk of triggering a wider Middle East war and potentially a nuclear war.
You are absolutely right that this is very, very dangerous globally. You cannot have success of Zionism and colonialism in Palestine without regional wars and without involvement of the US supporting this. It cannot happen. It would not happen if the U.S. and other Western countries like Britain and Australia and other countries have not sponsored or co-sponsored this project, if you want, of destruction of our region, the Arab world. The Arab world, an Islamic world, is a very large area that stretches from Morocco to Afghanistan and Western China even. This region is very, very important. It has a lot of natural resources, geographically at the center of the three continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, etc., Australia even. All of the world is connected through this region. And from the beginning, from the San Remo Conference, 1920, the Western powers, who were imperialist in their thinking and were still imperialist and colonialist, but they thought of new ways of colonization. San Remo Conference is very important to read, 1920, to understand what their plans. Their plans was fragmentation, control, and management of this region so that it remains under Western hegemony. Zionism was thought of as a tool of imperialism before. That this is just because they want to set up right at the dividing line between Asia and Africa, this country called Israel, a Jewish state, to serve British and other imperial interests. What they didn't realize is they also created a monster that they cannot control. And it turned out the other way around, that this monster they created, the State of Israel and its arms, the World Zionist Congress and the World Zionist Organization and its entities around the world, are actually now managing the U.S. In fact, the last U.S. president to challenge Israel or begin to challenge Israel was John F. Kennedy, and he was assassinated. He wanted Israel to register the APAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as a foreign lobby, as they should by U.S. law. And he wanted also to check Israel's nuclear capabilities. They don't develop nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And so these two things caused his demise, basically.
Well, he also was insisting on the return of the Palestinian refugees, which Ben Gurion said would be would result in the death of the Israeli state.
There are many Palestinian refugees who still have John F. Kennedy's picture in their shanty rooms and stuff. Yes, I considered him as a potential savior, and of course he was assassinated. So it's an interesting phenomenon that after that, and especially, and APAC, by the way, what date was APAC was formed? APAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, was formed in 1957, the year I was born, actually. This is 6 months after another president challenged Israel, Eisenhower, who told Israel to withdraw from the Sinai and the Gaza Strip, and his words was on the phone to the Israeli Prime Minister, "We want you to withdraw promptly." And indeed, within 24 hours, Israeli army was withdrawing from the Sinai desert. This shows you that how much power the U.S. had if they chose to exercise it. They made Israel withdraw from the Sinai and the Gaza Strip in 1956. The response to that was to set up the APAC and the lobby and strengthen the lobby in the U.S. And then Kennedy, whose idol was Eisenhower, and he was working on his campaign, came and tried to do something. And since then, since the early 1960s, and especially after 1967, Israel has kind of taken charge of U.S. foreign policy, if I may say so. And now the State Department, I mean, I have a State Department official. I was with him on the phone this morning because of this conference, online, not on the phone, but online I was with him. His name is Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department.
Yes, recently.
Recently, over this genocide in Gaza. And he thinks there's something drastically wrong when a whole country is held hostage, a superpower is held hostage by a small state called Israel and its lobbyists in Washington.
Well, famously, Patrick Buchanan, a conservative Republican who ran for president, described Congress as Israeli-occupied territory.
Yeah.
And for telling that truth was denounced as an anti-Semite. Wow. And similarly, Ron Paul, who ran as an anti-war Republican,
absolutely,
was marginalised by the American media and demonised by the Zionist lobby for his attack on neoconservatives. Perhaps we can finish up with one question about the Palestinian people. They have resisted heroically for a century, and things have gotten worse and worse, but the resistance is still going on even in the midst of this horror in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see things progressing? How can Palestinians continue to resist? How are they continuing to resist?
Thank you for this question, because I think it's good not to focus only on the symptoms and on the underlying etiology or causes of our problems, but to think of solutions and the future. I wrote another book called Sharing the Land of Canaan, which you have. That's about the future, and speaking about how we can have a post-colonial structure in Palestine where we live in harmony with each other, regardless of our religions or background, but also in harmony with nature. I have a chapter on it, on the environment, which we'll have to have another session talk just about the environmental injustice of colonization, just like here in Australia, environmental injustice of colonization. But anyways, our future can be a bright future, can be a future of sustainability of people and of nature. And we in the Palestine, I and my wife and a few other volunteers, I'm also a volunteer, started this institute, Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability, with that explicit vision for sustainability of human and natural communities. And we work on this via research, education, conservation, community service, marginalized communities, women, children, Bedouins, villages in the areas near the wall which cannot even harvest their olive trees during the harvest season. So we help these communities, we promote sustainability, we have permaculture, we have eco-friendly agriculture, we have a community garden, our own botanic garden that's open to the public. The refugees come and plant and grow their own vegetables. All of these are forms of resistance. By educating our children at the universities, at the schools, we're engaged in resistance. So in my book, Popular Resistance in Palestine, I talk about hundreds of forms of resistance that are positive resistance by engaging in positive actions, by building. These are collectively called by us Palestinians, we call them sumud. Sumud is more than, it's hard to translate. It's not just persistence. It's resilience, resistance, active resistance.
Steadfastness.
It's a combination of all these things. And we would like people to join us in this struggle. Australians, anybody in the world should join, because it's a struggle for humanity, not just for Palestine. And our website, PalestineNature.org, has more details. So,
Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh, thank you very much.
Thank you.